Ever get that feeling, like you're grappling with some philosophical heavyweight? You're wading through these dense arguments, interpretations, and it's like being lost in a labyrinth.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
What if we could just cut through all that, get right to those core insights, those bits that truly matter, especially for someone, well, with your philosophical background? That's what we're aiming for today.
Cutting to the chase.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Deep dive into the work of John Langshaw Austin.
A figure, whose influence just keeps resonating. A real philosophical powerhouse.
No doubt about it. John Langshaw Austin lived from 1911 to 1960, held the prestigious White Professorship of Moral Philosophy at Oxford. His contributions were, well, massive. He touched upon knowledge, perception, action, freedom, truth, language.
And of course, those speech acts.
Oh, absolutely. His work on speech acts, groundbreaking. As a philosopher yourself, you'll instantly recognize how crucial his distinctions between locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary acts are.
They've become, well, almost like the bedrock of how we analyze language now.
They really have. So our mission today, and we're pulling from that excellent Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy entry, is to really break down Austin's key ideas, understand their impact, their ripples within the whole philosophical landscape. It's worth noting, how wide-ranging his intellectual influences were. He wasn't just engaging with the classics like Aristotle and Plato.
Oh, he went far beyond that.
He did. He was also in dialogue with his contemporaries, figures like G.E. Moore, John Cook Wilson, A.J. Pritchard. And there's even that great anecdote about Pritchard trying to actually exclude the vigorous Austin from his lectures.
Speaks volumes, doesn't it? About Austin's intellectual presence, his energy. It sets him right within that Oxford realism current.
It does, right into the thick of it. And Austin's leanings towards Oxford realism, they emphasize this view that our perception and knowledge, they aren't these indirect representations. They're more like direct ways of grasping a world that exists independent of our minds. So to dive right in, let's start with language. He's often lumped together with Ryle, Strawson, and the later Wittgenstein.
Under that ordinary language philosophy banner.
Exactly. That label, though, as the encyclopedia wisely points out, it can be, well, a bit misleading. It can mask some pretty significant differences in their methods and what drove them.
A crucial point. They might have shared this interest in everyday language, but the philosophical engines driving their work, those were quite distinct.
Absolutely. For Austin, his fascination with language, it stemmed from two main sources. First, he understood just how fundamental a role language plays in the whole fabric of human activity. It's everywhere, shaping everything.
It really is.
And second, he saw the careful study of language as, well, almost like an essential tool.
Mm-hmm.
Often the very first step in tackling those age-old philosophical problems. His essay, A Plea for Excuses, it's a prime example of this method in action.
Couldn't agree more. And Stuart Hampshire, in the entry, he makes this great observation. He said Austin brought the same level of commitment to truth, to rigor, to philosophical arguments as he would to any serious intellectual endeavor. He wasn't interested in specialized jargon, the kind that's divorced from that everyday clarity.
He wasn't. His stance was clear. Philosophers, they should either articulate their claims in plain, ordinary language, the kind that holds up under scrutiny, or they should take on the very demanding task of defining a technical vocabulary, define it rigorously, and then stick to it consistently. Austin, he believed a good way to approach those grand philosophical questions was to ground them in specific everyday claims, judgments we can be, well, fairly confident about.
He was really sharp in seeing the dangers of philosophers jumping the gun, addressing those abstract issues before properly acknowledging the subtle distinctions that are already woven into our everyday language.
Exactly. The encyclopedia highlights two major risks here. First, we risk overlooking crucial distinctions, distinctions that our ordinary language implicitly recognizes, even if we don't always consciously see them. And second, we can get caught in these dilemmas, these seemingly inescapable traps that pop up when we fail to grasp those linguistic nuances. Austin himself warned us, he said, and I'm quoting here, "We must not expect to find simple labels for complicated cases. However well-equipped our language, it can never be forearmed against all possible cases that may arise and call for description. Fact is richer than diction." So for you as a philosopher, this is a call for humility, a reminder of just how complex the world is and the inherent limitations of even our most refined linguistic tools.
It is. It's like remembering that the map, it's not the territory. And our linguistic maps, no matter how detailed, they'll always fall short of the sheer richness of reality.
That's a great analogy. He also pointed out that judging statements as true or false, it isn't always, this simple black and white affair. Think about propositions like Belfast is north of London or the galaxy is the shape of a fried egg. Austin argued that there are degrees of success in making statements like these, and their accuracy, it can depend on the specific context, our intentions when we communicate, and the practical purpose behind our words.
It really highlights how crucial context is in judging truth, even for claims that on the surface seem completely factual. For you, this challenges any simple notion of a direct link between language and reality. It's not that straightforward.
You're right, it isn't. He famously compared words to tools. Like, just as we need to make sure our tools are clean or in good working order, we need to be clear about what our words mean.
Yeah.
We also can't forget words aren't the facts themselves. We have to examine them critically, sort of peel them off the world, so to speak, to really understand their limitations and avoid getting trapped by their inherent structure. It lets us see the world, well, with fresh eyes.
He also believed that within our common vocabulary, we've got generations of wisdom baked right in. It reflects distinctions and connections that they've proven to be important as we navigate the world. These distinctions, they've been refined through countless interactions. They often have this subtlety and practical relevance that abstract theorizing can easily miss.
That's right. So meticulous investigation of language. For Austin, it was a vital first step. Before building any philosophical or scientific theories, he wasn't against revising existing frameworks, but he was adamant that those revisions, they had to be grounded. They couldn't stem from neglecting the intricate details of how we actually use language. The entry also mentioned some key critiques of this approach, notably from Paul Grice.
Yes. Grice, he emphasized the essential role of rational cooperation in how we use and interpret language. Yeah. He argued that whether our utterances are appropriate, it's not just about truth conditions and the immediate situation. It goes beyond that.
Right. The critique was that Austin and maybe other ordinary language philosophers, they might have overlooked these broader pragmatic factors, the ones that influence how we judge what's appropriate and meaningful to say. Philosophers like Ayer and Searle, they raised similar concerns early on.
But the encyclopedia, it smartly points out that Austin was sensitive to these more subtle aspects of communication, the wider context of what we say. His statement, "It takes two to make a truth," it's a perfect example. It shows his awareness of the interactive dimension of language, how we build shared understanding together.
Okay, let's dig into Austin's contributions to the philosophy of language, especially his views on truth. The encyclopedia, it lays out several distinctive claims he made. First, he said that the phrase is true. It has a descriptive function. It's used to characterize a specific relationship, the relationship between statements and the facts they're supposed to be about.
And then building on that, his second point was that the facts that matter when we determine the truth of a statement, those are always particulars. They're specific objects, properties, events, or states of affairs in the world, the concrete stuff.
Exactly. His third point, and it's crucial, is that this connection between statements and facts, it's not random. It's underpinned by conventions, both general conventions that link types of sentences to types of situations and more specific conventions that connect individual instances of stating something to particular facts.
And this is where the human element really comes in, according to Austin. His fourth point was that our human judgment, which is shaped by our intentions, our goals, and the specific context we're speaking in, it plays a vital role in figuring out truth. It's not just about matching a sentence's meaning to a bare fact out there. It's more involved than that.
It is. He even suggested that two utterances using the exact same sentence, referring to the same facts, but said at different times with different aims to get different truth values.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, despite his emphasis on that descriptive function of is true, Austin seemed to lean towards a sort of deflationism about truth.
Yeah. He seemed to be saying in his fifth point that to call a statement true, it's often like giving it a general thumbs up, saying it's satisfactory, accurate, correct, fair, depending on the situation.
The entry is right to frame Austin's famous 1950 paper Truth as a direct response to P.F. Strawson's view. Strawson said, "That is true. It works more like a performative." to express agreement or endorsement, rather than describing something. Strawson even accused those who disagreed with him of committing the descriptive fallacy.
And Austin, while acknowledging that there might be performative aspects to how we use true, he was set on defending its core descriptive role, how it connects statements to the world.
His analysis, it zeroed in on the truth of what he called statings, these concrete historical events of people making assertions, and how these connect to the truth of what is stated, the underlying propositions, the content. He was on board with a correspondence theory of truth. He famously said, when it corresponds to the facts. But his main concern was getting a deeper grasp on what correspondence and facts really mean.
And that's where his two types of conventions are so important. The descriptive conventions that link sentences to those general types of situations, and the demonstrative conventions that tie specific utterances to particular situations out there in the world.
You got it. Think about a simple sentence like, the cat is on the mat. Descriptive conventions, they establish what it means in any situation where you've got a cat sitting on a mat. But to actually say something about a specific case, like your cat Luna chilling on your favorite rug, we got to use those demonstrative conventions. Maybe use the present tense or point while we're talking.
So for Austin, a statement, it hits truth when the particular state of affairs it's talking about, because of those demonstrative conventions, is of the same type as the general state of affairs that the sentence, because of the descriptive conventions, is linked to.
And being of a type with which, it's not just about things looking alike. Austin made it clear that it means being sufficiently like those standard states of affairs with which. It's about judgment, a conventional agreement that goes beyond mere similarity.
And that leads to a pretty significant implication for you as a philosopher. Particular things in the world, they don't come pre-labeled with their category. Truth, then, it becomes dependent on our human ways of classifying things. And it can change depending on the specific context and what our goals are.
Precisely. Even with the same sentence, the same reality underneath, the truth of what's stated can shift. It depends on the specific occasion it's uttered and what the speaker wants to communicate. The encyclopedia, it uses Austin's examples and emphasizes this broader point. Sentences themselves, they aren't inherently true or false. It's the specific statements we make using them that carry truth values.
Which means that when we do philosophical analysis, the meaning of a sentence alone isn't enough to determine its truth conditions, or even to fully spell out what proposition is being expressed.
Right. That classic example, Francis Hexagonal, it shows this perfectly. Out of context, or in some abstract philosophical discussion, that sentence, it might not even be stating something that we can judge as true or false. It's more like a rough description. Works fine for some things, like a quick geographical overview, but not for others, like super accurate map making.
And that links back to his deflationary ideas about truth. He wasn't buying Strawson's purely performative account, but he also saw truth as a kind of basic standard, a general endorsement that covers more specific judgments, like whether something is fair, reasonable, or accurate, kind of like how the concept of freedom has all these different facets.
Okay, let's move on to Austin's groundbreaking work on speech acts and how it all connects to truth. This is where his influential book, How to Do Things with Words, really comes into the picture. As the encyclopedia points out, this work adds another layer to why sentences don't automatically have truth values just because they correspond to facts.
That's because any sentence, it can be used to do a whole bunch of different linguistic things. It goes way beyond just stating something that's meant to be judged true or false.
You got it. At first, he made this clear distinction between constative utterances, where the main job is to state something and so we can assess their truth value, and performative utterances, which actually do things through the act of being said, and we evaluate those based on other things, like whether they're successful, appropriate, what he called happiness or felicity, like when you say I do in a wedding ceremony.
And Austin initially said that performatives, because they do something, not just describe something, they're not true or false.
Yeah, but as the encyclopedia correctly notes, that wasn't his final word on it. As Austin went deeper into how language works, he changed his mind quite a bit. He came to see that performatives, they are subject to judgment, not in terms of truth, but in terms of whether the conditions for them to work are met. Like, were the right procedures followed? Did the speaker have the authority to do what they did? You know, like in the marriage vow, if you say I do without the legal right or the real intention, that's an unhappy performative. It doesn't quite work.
He also realized that many acts we do with words, we can't just neatly sort them into constative or performative. A single utterance can, can do multiple things at once. If you say, I believe you, for example, you're expressing a belief, a state of mind, and also making a statement that could be true or false.
Exactly. And that realization led to him basically dismantling that initial constitutive performative divide in his later work. He saw that just like constitutives can be off in different ways, performatives often have factual assumptions built in or implications that could be true or false. This led him to develop his more sophisticated, more comprehensive model of speech acts.
The one with those 3 interconnected levels. The locutionary act, which is that basic act of saying words, with their specific sounds, grammar, and meaning. It includes the phatic act, just uttering the sounds, and the rhetic act, having a particular meaning. Then there's the illocutionary act, the specific action you perform by saying something, like stating, warning, promising, questioning, each with its own force. And finally, the perlocutionary act, which is about the effects of your utterance on the listener, whether intended or not.
And as the encyclopedia highlights Austin's focus, it really shifted to that illocutionary act and its complex role in how we judge utterances, which isn't just about true or false, but also about whether they're, happy or unhappy. He said that traditional philosophy had made a big mistake, thinking of truth as something that applies mainly to those locutionary acts, all by themselves, without considering their illocutionary force.
His main insight was that true and false, they're more like general ways of judging whether, in a particular situation for a particular audience and given specific goals, saying something was the right or wrong thing to do. It's about the whole act, not just the words themselves.
And this is where he famously criticizes what he calls the true-false fetish and the value-fact fetish. He's suggesting that these simple either categories, they're often too crude. They don't capture the real complexity of how we use language, and how factual stuff and judgments are all tangled up in how we evaluate what people say.
It really emphasizes just how important the situation and the context are when we use and judge language.
Let's shift gears now and look at Austin's work in epistemology and the philosophy of perception, mostly found in his essays, Other Minds, and his book, Sense and Sensibilia, published after his death. The encyclopedia gives us a good overview of his main ideas in these areas. First, he saw knowledge as a basic, a fundamental way of grasping reality, a kind of guarantee and assurance. That's where that saying, if you know you can't be wrong, comes from. Although, as we'll see, his understanding of that was, pretty nuanced. And this puts him right in line with Oxford realists.
His second point was that knowledge doesn't come from some special, infallible mental state. It comes from using our ordinary judgment skills successfully, what he called acumen. And these skills need to be operating under good external conditions or, as he put it, opportunity.
But importantly, his third point is that our human judgment, it's inherently limited. We can make mistakes even when our minds are working perfectly and everything seems ideal externally. We're not perfect.
And this inherent fallibility, according to Austin, it doesn't mean we can't have real knowledge or function well in the world. The possibility of being wrong, it's always there in the background of our attempts to know things.
Which has big implications for foundationalism. The idea that our knowledge, it all rests on these absolutely certain, unshakable beliefs. Austin's views suggest that there aren't any inherently infallible foundational claims. And there aren't any claims that are uniquely fallible either. The potential to be wrong, it's everywhere in all our knowledge claims. But so is the potential to have solid knowledge about everyday things.
In perception, Austin, again, sticking with that Oxford realism, argued that when we perceive things, we have to be in direct contact with the environment itself. It's not just about being aware of private internal sense data or mental representations. We're actually reaching out into the world.
And he was a real critic of those classic philosophical arguments for sense data, like the argument from illusion. He found them unconvincing, often based on misinterpretations of how we usually experience things. He also emphasized that a lot of what we know, we don't get it through seeing or hearing directly. We get it through testimony, through being told things by people who know what they're talking about.
Interestingly, he also suggested that when we say we know something, it can be like giving an assurance to other people, giving them a solid reason to believe things themselves or to act in certain ways. He even considered this somewhat controversial idea that saying, I know that, can sometimes function as a performative, a bit like making a promise.
He made this useful distinction between challenging someone's claim to know something, which usually involves asking, how do you know? What's your evidence? And challenging a belief, which is more about asking, why do you believe that? What are your reasons? He famously said, saying I know is not saying I've performed a specially striking feat of cognition.
Knowledge isn't about showing off how smart you are.
For Austin, knowledge was more like the natural result of our judgment skills.
Yeah.
Skills honed by language, working together with the opportunities we get from our experiences or from the reliable testimony of others. He saw us as first perceiving these unclassified particulars. And then to have knowledge, we go through this process of classifying them based on how similar they seem to our past experiences. And that seemingly obvious principle, if I know, I can't be wrong, the encyclopedia points out that Austin wasn't totally on board with it without some careful qualifications.
Yeah.
While he understood why it seemed so intuitively true, he didn't agree with the strong interpretation that to know something, it has to be absolutely impossible for you to be wrong. And that's because he recognized that human judgment, it's inherently fallible. We can be mistaken.
And this nuanced understanding, it directly challenges foundationalism because it shows that even our most basic judgments, they can be pretty secure. And on the flip side, no type of judgment is totally immune to the possibility of error. The encyclopedia mentions his vivid pig example from Sense and Sensibilia, where if you clearly see a pig in normal circumstances, there's no real room for doubt, even though in some bizarre scenario, it could turn out to be a sheep in disguise.
He gave this detailed analysis of all the ways our claims to knowledge can be challenged. He was careful to distinguish between questioning our credentials as knowers, our reliability, and questioning whether the facts themselves are actually true. His idea of enough is crucial here. It suggests that for a knowledge claim to be justified, we only have to rule out those possibilities of error that are relevant, not every single conceivable, often wildly improbable scenario.
That enough is enough concept, as the entry points out, it's open to different interpretations, and philosophers are still debating it. It raises questions about how the context affects justification, whether we're allowed to make certain background assumptions, and how we decide which possibilities are serious enough to consider.
And finally, there's that fascinating and kind of controversial performative view of I know. While there are objections, saying it seems descriptively wrong and its exact function is debated, the encyclopedia suggests that Austin might have been drawn to it because of the similarities he saw between saying you know something and making a promise.
Yeah.
They both involve some kind of commitment, giving your word. Maybe he was also influenced by earlier views about how knowledge is something we're directly aware of internally.
It seems like he was trying to capture that sense of responsibility we have when we claim to know something, and the implicit assurance that often comes with a genuinely sincere claim to know.
Finally, let's look at Austin's work on action and freedom, mainly laid out in his pieces A Plea for Excuses and Ifs and Cans. The encyclopedia points out three things that stand out in his approach. First, he deliberately focuses on the very specific, detailed ways we talk about particular actions, instead of going for those big abstract notions of free will.
Second, he makes this bold argument that to be responsible for our normal everyday actions, we don't always have to be doing them voluntarily or with a conscious intention. It's not always about consciously choosing every little thing.
Right. And third, there's his leaning towards incompatibilism, the view that determinism, the idea that everything is causally predetermined, it might not fit with our common sense understanding of how we act and free will. It's a tricky issue.
He saw those broad terms like acting freely, not as referring to some single underlying ability we have, but more like what he called dimension words that lump together a bunch of different, more specific descriptions, not just the actions themselves, but also the things that increase our responsibility, the aggravations, like acting deliberately on purpose. And then those things that lessen or remove our responsibility, the excuses, like accidents or mistakes. It's a whole spectrum.
His essay, A Plea for Excuses, it argued that we get a much better understanding of responsibility by really looking closely at when different excuses are considered valid. If you can't offer a good excuse for something you did, then you're usually held fully responsible. His goal was to reveal the inner workings of human action, how intelligence, planning, and control all play together in what we do.
And his concept of no modification without aberration, it's really insightful. He said that for most of our normal routine actions, like just sitting down or yawning when we're tired, it's strange to add words like voluntarily or involuntarily. It sounds odd.
Like it implies there's something unusual or wrong with the action.
Exactly. He said that philosophers often make this mistake of assuming there's just one single mechanism that handles freedom and responsibility, one that's strengthened by aggravations and canceled out by excuses. Austin, he argued for a more subtle picture. He said that different mechanisms might be at work, explaining why we feel free when we do different kinds of things.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. When it comes to the debate about determinism and free will, Austin really focused on the excuse we often use. I couldn't help it. He looked closely at how compatibilists try to analyze what can means, especially G.E. Moore and P.H. Noel Smith, but he raised some serious objections, most notably with his example of missing a putt in golf.
It seems simple, but it gets to the heart of his belief that our abilities, they're not foolproof. We can have the skill, the intention to do something right and still mess up. And that possibility of failing, it seems hard to square with a strictly deterministic view where every event is inevitable because of cause and effect.
It does. He also introduced the idea of abilities being masked, where you might be able to do something, but something prevents you from doing it successfully, like some outside constraint or something getting in the way. He seemed doubtful that we could ever come up with a complete and non-circular way of listing all the ways an ability could be masked or blocked.
It's a tough nut to crack.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that John Langshaw Austin's work, it's still incredibly influential in philosophy, especially in how we study language and knowledge.
Absolutely. His dedication to carefully analyzing ordinary language, it gave philosophers a really powerful and lasting tool to wrestle with even the most abstract and persistent philosophical problems.
And for you as a philosopher, a key takeaway could be that paying close attention to the little details in our everyday language, it's still crucial, even when we're tackling those abstract philosophical concepts. Plus, his work on the connections between language, truth, and action, it's still relevant today for all those philosophical debates going on.
It leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder. Given Austin's emphasis on context and the often overlooked wisdom in how we use language every day, how might we rethink how we analyze those philosophical concepts, the ones that seem straightforward on the surface, but that carry all this baggage from how we use them in everyday life? What fetishes, to use Austin's term, might we still be clinging to in our own philosophical thinking without even realizing it?
That's a great question to sit with. Definitely gives us a lot to think about as we move towards future deep dives into those philosophical areas that are still building on Austin's truly groundbreaking work.